Good morning, wherever you are in the world. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Today, we're looking at the topic of runway excursions. Runway excursions is where an aircraft goes off the runway. A runway incursion is when an aircraft doesn't follow ATC instructions and goes on, for example, an active runway or taxiway. So this is a bit different. It's different for us in the vocabulary that we actually use, because there's a lot more vocabulary here that we need to understand in an audio communication. Also, a lot more vocabulary that we need to use in description of, for example, a picture element. For example, what we're looking at over here in these pictures that you see here is a runway excursion on the left and on the right. What vocabulary can we use to describe these incidents, accidents? Well, we can say if the aircraft goes off the side of the runway, if it goes off the side, it has veered off. Whereas if it goes off the end, it can overshoot. Notice I'm using the word go off the end of the runway, which is another way of saying that the aircraft overshot or overran. So I can say, instead of saying go off the end of the runway, I can say the aircraft went off the end of the runway, or use the words overshot or overran, which I'm going to explain here today. So again, picture description is where you have to make a description of the picture that you see in front of you. Depending on the exam that you're taking, then the examiner will ask questions about the topic. So this topic is runway excursions. Normally, you don't have a lot of time to describe what you're seeing in the picture, so you have to be concise. So to be concise as a pilot, you have to apply logic. The logic that is best used in an ICAO picture description context is use the three tenses. For example, past, what happened? What was the cause if we know it? Present, what is happening now at this moment? What can you see? And future, what do you think is going to happen next? Then you've got a context to respond. But remembering, you only have a short period of time to respond in a picture description, probably no more than 45 seconds, which is not a lot of time. What we don't want to do is get wrapped up in, the cause. And the idea is to give as much vocabulary as possible connecting that. So for example, I could go into detail about the cause of what happened in this accident with an Embraer 190 of Aero Republica, which happened, a few years back. Basically, but I don't have the time to go into that, and maybe I don't know what the problem is. What I can say is what it says over here: the airplane touched down late. Too late. That means probably not a stabilized approach, and it ran off the side of the runway and went down an embankment. So this was a veer off. Then I can go, what's happening now? The escape slides are deployed. Passengers have been evacuated before. This is probably the day after, where the conditions are better, etc. What we're learning is that there's certain essential vocabulary that we need to identify and use in our description. For example, vocabulary such as overrun. This is in the present tense. So if I'm making a picture description of, for example, this, it's not the present tense, it's happened in the past. So it looks to me like this was an overrun or overran. The aircraft overran the runway, or possibly the aircraft overshot the runway, or the aircraft veered off. When I'm making a description, I'm using what happened not now, but in the past. So I have to convert from present to past. So veer off, veered off, overshoot, overshot. Or you could say it has gone off the end of the runway, or it went off the end of the runway. Obviously important for us as well, and important for the exam, is to be able to define what actually is the definition of a runway excursion. And then again, I can use these words we've just identified. A runway excursion is a veer off from the side of, an overrun or overshoot from the end of the runway surface. So I'm converting again. Here I'm using present, but if I'm making a picture description, I'm using past. Also, we need to identify the causes that we're going to talk about in this module today. So these surface events occur while an aircraft is taking off or landing. There are many factors that may cause a runway excursion, including a runway contamination, adverse weather conditions, mechanical failure, pilot error, and unstable approaches. Normally, it's not just one, but a combination of a few. So we need to be able to identify this information to make a clear and concise description. The focus words in terms of runway excursion, what I call the important words, are destabilized approach. We need to define what exactly is a destabilized approach. In other words, the approach is stable until, and what are the consequences of that? It could also be a mechanical failure. What are we talking about with mechanical failure? A hydraulic failure. What are we talking about here? It could be that you have, for example, no nose gear. It cannot extend. Therefore, you're actually having to land with partial hydraulics, or it might be complete hydraulic failure. Or it could be a failure of the brakes, or it could be a failure of the for example, reverse thrust system, or a failure to apply them in time, human factor, human error. Maybe it's another mechanical condition, for example, the condition of the tire. Again, using vocabulary, the tire tread, the tire grip, the tire was bald, the tire was flat, the tire was punctured. Or it could be a contaminated runway, a degraded runway. What is a contaminated runway? Normally, when 25% or more of the runway surface can be covered, for example, with standing water, ice, and normally at a certain level of depth, because that is going to affect my braking action. And if I cannot stop in time, runway too short, etc., what's going to happen? I'm going to make an excursion. I'm going to go off the end of the runway or veer off the side. The critical thing here is braking action. And obviously for us as pilots, making the right decision, knowing that, that we have sufficient braking action to stop in the calculated length of runway. If we cannot stop, excursion, we're off the end. Words that we learned in weather, for example, the aircraft skidded off, okay, are important here when we're making a description in a picture. It looks to me like the aircraft skidded off the runway. Why? It was too much water, it was wet, it was icy. Or we could say the aircraft slid off the runway. And also we need to remember the wind factor, gusty crosswinds, wind shifting, and wind shear, and rejected takeoff, maybe too late. When I was in the Air Force, way back when, okay, the Air Force taught me a few things. Here's a picture of me when I was 18 years old, a long time ago. It taught me many things. Some of those principles I use today. And one of those principles, which I share with you, is use the question and the answer. It gives you time to think. And another great principle, the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. Do not complicate the actual answer. This has helped me in my career. Here you see me making an approach into Fiji Islands, South Pacific, a long time ago on an island of BN12, okay? So I use these principles when I apply them to how I teach. So the principle is use the question in the answer, all right? Why? I'm going to use the correct tense, and it gives me time to think. So if I take a question like, why do we need to minimize the risk of runway excursions? I would use the question and the answer and say, we need to minimize, reduce runway excursions as they're the most common type of accident for airlines and the most commercially expensive in terms of risk. Why? Because airlines and manufacturers are utilizing higher capacity commercial aircraft, which carry more people and require more runway length to land. Also, there's a very real potential for an overrunning aircraft to collide with houses, cars, roads, and other public infrastructure beyond the runway end if adequate and safety areas or other do not exist. Now, we do have special devices now at the end of runways to stop more damage in the local community. That way, I'm going to show you some of those today as well. Our learning objectives, though, folks, are this, okay? What you need to be able to do is to be able to define what is a runway excursion. Well, we've already done that. We're going to look at the main causes of runway excursions. Here's the key. Why are these things still happening? Why are they so common? And also, what can be done to prevent, to mitigate runway excursions? Obviously, knowing what an incursion is, we need to make a comparison. What is the difference between an incursion and an excursion? And also, why are excursions more common in winter or cold weather conditions? Well, there's the answer, the conditions. We're dealing with contaminated runway, icy runways. So basically, our braking action is reduced. And then we can start to bring in those crazy words like slid off the runway, skidded off the runway. That's where they come in description. And a question like, what are some of the causes of landing accidents? Again, let me reiterate, you're sitting under exam conditions. You might not have it going through your mind. What is the examiner saying by what are some of the causes of landing accidents? So then say to the examiner, please, can you ask me the question a different way? I'm not understanding your question. Okay, what are some of the causes of runway excursions? Again, please understand that you're a pilot. As a pilot, you're responsible for safety. If you don't understand the question, it's a good idea to say, hey, I don't understand. Please ask me the question a different way. Here's the thing. You do not lose points for this type of technique, because pilots, if they don't understand, are supposed to ask for confirmation or clarification. So if you sit there and don't understand the question and try and answer it incorrectly, not good. But if you don't understand, you have a chance to say, hey, please, can you ask me the question a different way? And that way around, you're not losing points. You're able to answer the question, and you're also demonstrating in an IKO exam that if I am not sure, I will ask for clarification. Therefore, we cannot take points away from you because you're asking for clarification, which is what we want. When we're reviewing things, we said at the beginning of this that, you know, many ways, many reasons for an excursion is the failure of the pilot human factors to make a stabilized approach. In other words, the approach becomes unstable or destabilized. Two words, same thing. So it comes to us on the flight deck to make sure that for a stabilized approach, as we see here, all flights must be stabilized 1,000 feet above airport elevation in IMC conditions, or 500 feet airport elevation when VMC AGL above ground level. You're probably asking yourself, well, you know, what is a stabilized approach? Well, that's the first part, 1,000 IMC, 500 VMC, but the aircraft on the correct flight path, the aircraft at the correct speed, the aircraft on the correct track, the aircraft in landing configuration, flaps, gear, and lights, all checklists completed. An approach becomes destabilized, unstable, below 1,000 IMC or 500 VMC AGL. The procedure is go around, and that is what we need to actually understand when we're talking about the procedures.